Hello everyone. I'm going to start talking about this Tao Tao DB14 that we just purchased for my son. Actually, he purchased with his own money. And there's a few things about this bike that I think are sorely lacking in information. And we're going to talk about the ins and outs of the China bike. And I think pretty well all of my friends on here, let me move this camera just a little bit. All of my friends online on YouTube pretty well know, but for anybody else, you might want to know, because these bikes come really cheap and as compared to a Japanese bike. So first thing, the size of these bikes. You cannot tell how big they are online. Well, from stem to stern here, we're 5 foot. That's 5 foot from front to back. And I'm just going to show you from the foot peg to the seat, you know, is about 18 inches. Okay? To the ground, I'll have to measure when I got it on the ground. But your handlebars are 27 inches from tip to tip. And this distance is 32 inches, or from the bottom of the tire is 41 inches approximately. Alright, you can see my bike, the Flea over here, it's the same size as a Mini Trail 50 Honda. It's a clone, also Chinese. Okay, we talked about oil changes. I done an oil change on it yesterday, and also I went over all the bolts, and I did find that this bolt on the Kickstarter right here was loose. I tightened it. All these other bolts you see with nuts on them, they're all locks. This is a lock bolt, a lock nut. This is a lock nut, and there are several others. The case bolts were all tight. This is a lock nut on the engine mount. It was tight. There was a couple of other ones that were a little looser than I'd like, but they wouldn't be what I'd call loose. Some of these plastics in the tank, and all those bolts were tight. The front and rear, both lock nuts, they were completely tight. Manifold's tight, carburetor's tight. These caps, this cap on the end of the head, it was tight. Exhaust was tight. We'll talk about back here in the back here in a minute. I found a couple of bolts that I was not real happy with, but it doesn't bother me so much because I turn wrenches plenty. So if you're not mechanically inclined, these may not be the bikes for you. I'm going to take the camera, as bad as I hate to move it because it's going to be wiggling around, but you need to see around so I can explain some things. So I'll move the camera where I can, and bear with me for a second. Alright. Yeah, you can probably see that. There's a bolt right here from the muffler bracket. This muffler bracket had to be bent a little bit because it was not quite fitting under here, and whoever assembled this bike stripped this bolt right here that holds the muffler, and it's still stripped, but it wouldn't bolt up in there very far at all. So I had to take the whole exhaust off and bend this bracket, put it back in here, and so I could run that bolt up far enough to hold. I mean, it probably would have held anyway, but it was loose. It was loose, and I don't think that's a manufacturer problem. I think that was an assembler problem. And let me think of what else I needed to do to it. Sorry about the camera. Alright, this is what I want to show you right here. These brackets that hold the handlebar, they were tilted all the way, so there was no gap on one side and a bunch of gap on the other. and both sides were that way. And what I did was I loosened them up and put the gap even and tightened it back down. I had a problem with these exhaust manifold studs. They were about halfway stripped, because I think that whoever assembled the bike whoever put this muffler on originally didn't take this plate off, and you can't get to that bolt back there. It kind of puts it in a bind. And then when they were fighting the muffler bolt back there that they stripped, they probably damaged it a little more. But it seems to be sealing and tightened down good, so I'm not going to worry about it. I can always put new studs in it if it becomes an issue. I changed the oil and I did not run that packing fluid other than what was seen on that live stream just for a minute, because it was clear and there wasn't hardly any in it to begin with. You know, it was just barely in the safe zone. So we rode it, and the after a time when we rode it, we started getting some oil from this vent tube, and my thoughts were that the oil was caused by maybe overfilling when I changed the oil. So I checked it and it seemed okay, and after a few minutes of riding, we'd get a little bit of oil, it would be bubbling out of there, and would actually get oil up into the filter and drip out a little. And so this happened several times, and I checked this line to make sure it was clear, and it doesn't feel like it's clear to the engine like it should be, which would be causing pressure. And there is quite a bit of pressure when that happens on the crankcase that I don't think should be there. And you can ride it a few minutes, and then when you stop, if you pay attention to it, you'll see it warm up. It did do it every time, but it did it a few times. So I'm going to go back and see if the flea over there, how much pressure, back pressure. I think there's a valve in there that regulates the pressure, it's supposed to. It only lets it come out of the crankcase and not back in. I'm going to have to check into that. But he rode it quite a bit, and I thought the chain was a little bit too tight, so I tried to adjust it out last night, and it's really not. It just needs to run that way till it'll loosen up as it's ridden. It will loosen up on its own. I'm getting kind of tongue-tied today. Other than that, the front struts are pretty stiff. I was amazed at how much force it took to compress them, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's I know that can be changed by the oil in them. Likes about this bike, I pretty much like everything. But you know, challenges of these Chinese made bikes don't really bother me, because I've had a Chinese bike for 4 years, and really with mine, I haven't done hardly anything to it. I think that maybe that's the exception and not the rule. But if you're mechanically inclined, I don't see why you can't save you a great deal of money. Just know that you will be, you know, you need to inspect it real good. And I'm sure there's 2 or 3 other little odds and ends I've done to it that I'm not thinking about. One thing is, when they packed it, they had this fender all tweaked, and actually it was tweaked on this side pretty good, bent, and you can see I took the heat gun and straightened it right out, which the only thing you might see is a little wavy and one tiny little spot there, but you can't see it unless you're looking for it. So if you're mechanically inclined, even a little, you can handle these bikes for what comes at you with them. It shifts good, it runs good, it's got a ton of power. It idles. That's something I can say that the flea is not, it does not idle all the time. Sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. It just, and I'm not sure why it does that, but I really like the bike. I like everything about it. You know, the put things together, like they only bent one half of this key. I like both of them bent like that. So, I mean that keeper. But other than the assembler not taking the time to make sure he didn't strip bolts, he or she, the nuts on the exhaust and the one at the muffler. Other than those two problems, and a few just you know, little minor tweaks, it was in pretty good shape. I expected that because I've read a bunch about these China bikes needing, you know, odds and ends and the bolts getting loose and that sort of thing. But I gotta say, the lock nuts are impressive, that they actually had lock nuts on there. And I'll tell you what though, I got too much butt for this seat. There's not nearly enough seat. and I tend to want to ride back here at the back. We'll sit back here, and there's virtually nothing. I mean, there's some padding here if you're younger, but if you know, I'm in my 40s, so I need a little more padding. If I sit right here where you're supposed to sit, then it's fine, but I tend to scoot back. I love these big wide foot pegs. They actually are made for a real size foot. Everything else feels pretty quality on it, just to be honest with you. I took it over some terrain. I took it up and down the driveway of Doom, got it up in high gear, run up through some big rocks and things. Feels solid. Motor's really responsive. I'd buy another one, even with the few things I did, like having the muffler off and all that already. That don't faze me in the least, especially when I know I can buy 3 of these for one Honda, you know. And of course, you don't have none of those problems when you get a Honda from, you know, or one of the main manufacturers. You're not going to have the issues, but you're also going to pay 3 prices, which is, you know, that's fine. Most people, if they don't want to ever touch up with a wrench, you know, or almost never, then that is the way they need to go. But anybody that's mechanically inclined should definitely think about it. And because we're gonna ride it, and if we have more problems with it, I'm gonna tell you about it. So you'll find out right here. And I thank you for watching. Get out and ride something.